Jerusalem, the year 1009. One act of destruction would send tremors through Christendom and lay the emotional groundwork for 2 centuries of war. On the orders of the Fatimid caliph Al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah, a ruler both feared and mysterious, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre was utterly destroyed. This was not just any building. To Christians, it was the holiest site on earth, believed to enclose the very tomb where Jesus Christ was buried and resurrected. Al-Hakim's men did not simply vandalize it, they demolished it to its foundations, even attempting to obliterate the sacred rock itself. News of this desecration horrified the Christian world. It was not seen merely as an act of war, but as a cosmic insult, a wound inflicted on the soul of Christendom itself. Importantly, by the time Urban preached the First Crusade, the Holy Sepulchre had been rebuilt and Christian pilgrims were again visiting Jerusalem. Yet this didn't diminish the propaganda value of its earlier destruction. Chroniclers like William of Tyre later pointed to Al-Hakim's act as a prime cause for the crusade, a crime that had to be avenged. In truth, the crusading movement had multiple causes, but the symbolism of Jerusalem's violated sanctity provided a powerful emotional impulse. The stage was set. Jerusalem, the holy city, was under Muslim rule, and tales of sacrilege cried out for redress. The late 11th century in Western Europe was a world of fragmented feudal kingdoms, vigorous faith, and restless warrior nobility. Politically, Europe was emerging from what later historians dubbed the Dark Ages and forming new identities. Several feudal states, notably France, England, the Holy Roman Empire, German lands, and others, jockeyed for power. These kingdoms were often at war with each other, as feudal lords and knights pursued land and glory. Society was steeped in a martial culture where local nobles maintained private armies of knights, and violence was a way of life. At the same time, the Catholic Church had become the unifying authority across these disparate realms. The Church was immensely powerful, owning land, influencing kings, and commanding the spiritual allegiance of the populace. Religious fervour was on the rise, fueled by a wave of monastic reform and popular piety. By the end of the 11th century, Western Europe was experiencing an intense religious feeling, a kind of revival that saw nobles and commoners alike eager to express their faith in action. Into this restless world, the Pope's voice would strike like a trumpet. In the autumn of 1095, the city of Clermont in southern France swarmed with clergy and laymen from across Europe. Pope Urban II had convened this council partly to discuss church reforms, but on November 18th, he unveiled a far more dramatic plan. Before this assembly, Urban denounced the plight of the Eastern Christians. Byzantine territories had been lost, and pilgrims were under constant threat. He spoke passionately about the urgent need to secure Jerusalem, the sacred city of Christ's passion, from those who had captured it. His words ignited the crowd's imagination. Urban announced that those who took up this cause to march to Jerusalem would receive full remission of their sins. He framed the expedition as an armed pilgrimage. Fighting under the cross would serve both God and one's own salvation. The assembly erupted, declaring it to be God's will. In that instant, the rallying cry of the Crusades was born. Urban's call also offered powerful incentives and reminded Western knights that instead of warring against each other, they could unite under a single banner in the East. He hinted at the rich spoils of war, cities teeming with treasure, fertile lands ripe for new lords, and trade riches beyond imagining. News of the Pope's decree spread across France, Germany, Italy, and beyond as men of all ranks vowed to take up the cross. The response was staggering. By 1096, tens of thousands had taken the cross, sewing cloth crosses to their garments as a sign of their vow. Contemporary estimates, likely inflated, spoke of up to 100,000 participants, but modern historians estimate roughly 60,000 to 70,000 people initially joined. including around 7,000 to 10,000 knights and nobles, clerics, monks, and even some women also set out. It was as much a mass migration as a military expedition. Pope Urban's banner and the idea of liberating Jerusalem electrified Europe. Liberating because in the Church's eyes the city belonged to Christ, and to hold it otherwise was an affront. In sermons, clerics taught that any Muslim rule in the Holy Land was only a temporary occupation, a wound on Christendom. The Holy Land was depicted as the patrimony of Christ, a God-given inheritance that had been taken. Thus freeing, it was framed not as worldly conquest, but as divine justice. The Crusades were framed as a sacred armed pilgrimage, giving warriors a holy purpose to reclaim Jerusalem, a spiritual homeland compared to biblical Israel. Pope Urban's rhetoric portrayed the Crusaders as continuing Christ's sacrifice, fighting evil under divine sanction. Religious symbolism, biblical imagery, and widespread preaching amplified this sacred mission, rallying commoners and nobles alike by presenting Jerusalem's liberation as a moral and spiritual duty. Yet religious fervor mingled with worldly motivations. Economic opportunity enticed landless nobles and knights seeking wealth, territories, and adventure. Stories of the exotic riches of the East, coupled with the chance for spiritual redemption, created a potent mix of faith, ambition, and adventure that inspired thousands to march eastward to Jerusalem. To sum up, Crusaders wore many intentions on their sleeves. In one man's heart it might be pure faith, in another thirst for wealth or glory. But as they gathered and marched east, these motives braided together. The Crusaders went forth believing that in freeing Jerusalem, they would gain not just salvation, but also new opportunities under God's blessing. In 1196, the official Crusader armies, composed of noble-led contingents, were finally on the move toward the Holy Land. Known collectively as the Prince's Crusade, these forces were not united under a single commander, but included prominent feudal lords such as Godfrey of Bouillon from the German-French frontier, Raymond IV of Toulouse from southern France, the Norman warrior Bohemond of Taranto and his nephew Tancred, Hugh of Vermandois, brother to the King of France, Robert Curthose of Normandy, Robert of Flanders, and Stephen of Blois. Each army departed separately, making the grueling trek toward Constantinople. Upon arrival, most leaders swore oaths to the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I, promising to return formerly Christian lands in exchange for provisions and guidance. For medieval people steeped in biblical tales, this narrative was powerful. The West was now Israel, and the Franks were God's chosen warriors. However, after years of marching and combat, their numbers had shrunk dramatically. By early 1099, only around 12,000 infantry and 1,500 knights remained. The Crusaders pressed south, determined to seize Jerusalem. By then, the city had changed hands. It was no longer under Seljuk rule, but had been taken by the Shia Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt in late 1098. The Fatimid vizier, Al-Afdal, offered the Crusaders a political compromise, suggesting they halt before entering Palestine. The Crusaders, however, would accept nothing short of Jerusalem itself. In June 1099, they arrived at the gates of the Holy City, preparing for the climactic siege that would define the First Crusade. On June 7th, 1099, the Crusaders reached Jerusalem, fulfilling their long pilgrimage but facing a formidable challenge. The city, held by the Fatimid governor Iftikhar al-Dawla, was well fortified, with high stone walls and bastions. The defenders had expelled local Christians, poisoned nearby wells, and stockpiled supplies in preparation. The Crusaders, around 13,000 strong, were exhausted, low on food and water, and initially demoralized in the intense Judean heat. On July 8th, seeking divine favor, the Crusaders performed a barefoot penitential procession around the city walls, invoking biblical symbolism from the Battle of Jericho. Their spirits revived, and soon after they received crucial reinforcements and siege materials by ship at the port of Jaffa. Using this, they built 2 siege towers. On July 13th to 14th, the assault began. Godfrey of Bouillon led the main attack from the north, while Raymond of Toulouse attacked from the south. On July 15th, Godfrey's forces breached the northern wall near Herod's Gate, allowing Crusaders to flood into the city. Iftikhar al-Dawla retreated to the Tower of David and later surrendered peacefully to Raymond, who ensured his safe exit. With that, Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders. The spiritual and military goal of the First Crusade had been achieved. Then came one of the darkest and most brutal episodes in the history of the Crusades, the massacre of Jerusalem's inhabitants in 1099. The Crusaders, having stormed the city after a long and grueling siege, unleashed a level of violence that stunned even their contemporaries. What followed was not a battle, it was a slaughter, driven by decades of pent-up religious fanaticism, bloodlust, and the desire to purify the city through sheer terror. Despite some Crusader leaders, like Tancred of Hauteville, offering nominal protection to those who had sought refuge in Al-Aqsa Mosque, these promises were quickly trampled in the chaos. The so-called warriors of Christ showed no mercy. Christian chroniclers themselves did not hide the carnage. Many were proud of it. Men, women and children, Muslims and Jews alike, were murdered indiscriminately in the streets, in their homes, and even in their places of worship. According to the chronicler Raymond of Aguilera, Jews had taken shelter in their main synagogue, only to be burned alive when the Crusaders set it on fire. Muslim civilians were hacked to pieces in alleyways and marketplaces. No one was spared. The death toll was staggering. While medieval sources offer vastly different numbers, ranging from 10,000 to 70,000, the precise figure is less important than the reality. The streets of Jerusalem ran red with blood. Even the World History Encyclopedia notes that the barbarism of the Crusaders shocked even Christians and would never be forgotten by the Muslim world. One eyewitness, Raymond of Aguilera, described how Crusaders rode in blood up to their knees and bridles inside the Al-Aqsa compound, perhaps an exaggeration, but one that captured the frenzy and savagery of the moment. William of Tyre, a later Christian chronicler, admitted that the ground was covered with blood and bodies, and the victors themselves were dripping with blood from head to foot. The city's once vibrant Jewish and Muslim communities were all but exterminated. The aim was clear. The Crusaders sought to transform Jerusalem into a pure Christian city by eliminating every trace of its non-Christian past. And after the killing, the blood-soaked soldiers, some barefoot in false humility, marched to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre to give thanks to God. Their campaign of holy terror was, in their minds, a divinely sanctioned miracle. Historians like Thomas Madden remark on the improbability of the Crusaders' victory, but for the medieval Crusaders, it was proof that God had rewarded their fanaticism. In their worldview, mass murder was not only acceptable, it was sacred. After capturing Jerusalem in July 1099, the Crusaders swiftly transformed the city into a Christian stronghold and capital of the newly formed Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem. Islamic holy sites were repurposed. The Dome of the Rock became the Templum Domini, Temple of the Lord, adorned with a cross and converted into a Christian church, while the Al-Aqsa Mosque was renamed the Templum Solomonis, Temple of Solomon. Initially used as a palace, it later became the headquarters of the Knights Templar, whose name derived from this location. The Crusaders admired the architecture of these buildings, even featuring the dome on coins and seals, but erased their Islamic identity by covering inscriptions and placing altars and crosses throughout. Elsewhere, mosques were destroyed, converted into chapels or stables, and Islamic symbols were systematically removed. Muslims and Jews were banned from living in the city. Only Eastern Christians, such as Greek and Syrian communities, were allowed to return for administrative and commercial purposes. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the original cause for the Crusade, was expanded and fully rebuilt under Queen Melisande in 1149, consolidating Christian holy sites under one roof. These sweeping changes were deeply traumatic for the Muslim world. The sight of Christian crosses atop Islamic shrines fueled long-lasting resentment and became symbols of humiliation. The Muslim response would come in time, most notably under Saladin, who would later reclaim Jerusalem and ritually cleanse these sacred spaces of Christian influence. Meanwhile, on July 22, 1099, Godfrey of Bouillon was chosen as Jerusalem's first Latin ruler. Refusing to wear a king's crown, where Christ had suffered, he accepted the more modest title, Advocate of the Holy Sepulchre. His brother Baldwin I, however, claimed the title of king after Godfrey's death. By 1100, the Crusaders had carved out 4 fragile Crusader states, Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, and Tripoli, surrounded by hostile Muslim powers. Though their grip on the region seemed solid, the foundations were weak, and the Islamic world was preparing for a counteroffensive that would ignite the next phase of this historic clash. After the Crusaders seized Jerusalem in 1099, the Muslim world was shocked and politically divided, with disunity between the Sunni Seljuks and Shia Fatimids contributing to the Crusaders' success. Initially dismissed as temporary invaders, the Crusaders' establishment of permanent states triggered growing calls for unity and jihad among Muslims. The massacre in Jerusalem, where Crusaders slaughtered thousands of Muslims, Jews, and even Christians, left a lasting scar. Muslim chroniclers like Ibn al-Athir and Ibn Kathir condemned the Crusaders as barbaric religious extremists, whose actions contrasted sharply with Islamic norms of warfare. For Ibn Kathir, the fall of Jerusalem was not just a military loss, but a spiritual catastrophe, calling for Muslim unity and the defense of sacred sites. These events deeply shaped the Muslim memory of the Crusades as a brutal distortion of Christianity. The first major Muslim counterattack came from Imad ad-Din Zengi, the powerful Atabeg of Mosul, who recaptured Edessa in 1144, the first Crusader state to fall. The victory shocked the Christian world. Western and Eastern Christians alike were devastated, prompting Pope Eugenius III to launch the Second Crusade in 1145. This time, 2 kings led the effort, Louis VII of France and Conrad III of Germany, joined by many nobles and inspired by the famous preacher Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. The campaign, however, was poorly executed. Both kings' armies suffered heavy losses en route through Anatolia. By the time they reached the Holy Land in 1148, Edessa was unrecoverable. Instead of launching a meaningful campaign, the Crusader leaders decided to attack Damascus, a former Muslim ally. The siege of Damascus failed disastrously after just a few days due to poor planning and strong Muslim defense. The defeated armies returned to Europe in disgrace. The crusade had gained nothing and damaged existing Christian-Muslim alliances. Meanwhile, Nur ad-Din, Zengi's son, rose as a key Muslim leader. After the failed siege of Damascus, the city aligned with him and he emerged as the leading champion of jihad. Unlike many earlier rulers, Nur ad-Din emphasized both military strength and religious legitimacy, promoting Islamic law and unity. Though he never lived to retake Jerusalem himself, his groundwork laid the path for Salah ad-Din, Saladin, his ambitious general and eventual successor. The failure of the Second Crusade marked a turning point. Muslim resistance had begun to unify under strong leadership, while European confidence in crusading faltered. Though St. Bernard blamed the West's sins for the failure, the real consequences were strategic. The Muslim world was now awakening, organizing, and preparing for a much larger counter-crusade. By 1187, the momentum had shifted entirely. Once fragmented emirs now marched as one under Saladin's banner. Mosques from Baghdad to Marrakesh echoed with blessings for Jerusalem's recovery. Stories traveled that Saladin carried with him a letter he had written years earlier declaring Jerusalem an obligation to God. Support poured in from all corners of Islam, the Sultan of Rum in Anatolia, the caliphs of Baghdad, and even distant emirates in Spain hailed Saladin's cause. In short, the Muslim world unified around the defense of Jerusalem, preparing for the final push to drive out the Franks. Following Nur ad-Din's death in 1174, Saladin moved to unify the Muslim world. By 1183, he had united Egypt and Syria with the aim of expelling the Crusaders and reclaiming Jerusalem. Tensions escalated in the 1180s, especially after Crusader Lord Reynald of Châtillon attacked Muslim caravans and threatened Mecca. In 1187, Saladin launched a massive campaign in response. The pivotal Battle of Hattin on July 4, 1187, saw Saladin lure the Crusader army, led by King Guy of Jerusalem, into a parched plain near the Sea of Galilee. Surrounded and dehydrated, the Christian forces were overwhelmed and utterly destroyed. Saladin's forces captured King Guy and seized the True Cross, a holy relic. Saladin executed Reynald personally for breaking the truce and ordered the mass execution of captured Templars and Hospitallers, viewed as extremist religious warriors. It was a crushing blow to the Crusader kingdom. In the following months, Saladin's forces swept through the Holy Land, recapturing major cities like Acre, Jaffa, Sidon, and Ascalon. By September 1187, only a few coastal outposts remained, and Jerusalem was surrounded. The liberation of Jerusalem in 1187 was not a tale of vengeance, but one of honor. After the crushing Crusader defeat at the Battle of Hattin, the fall of Jerusalem was all but certain. The last bastion of Christian resistance was led by Balian of Ibelin. Despite the odds, Balian organized a spirited defense, but the walls could not hold forever. On October 2, 1187, Jerusalem surrendered to Saladin. What followed, however, was not a bloodbath, but a moment that stunned even his enemies. Saladin did not seek revenge for the horrors of 1099, when Crusader forces had stormed Jerusalem and slaughtered nearly every Muslim and Jew in the city. Instead, he offered terms that were generous and just. Christian residents were allowed to ransom their freedom, and many of the poor were released without payment, either through Saladin's own mercy or the charitable contributions of his brother Al-Adil and others. Even Christian chroniclers who had once demonized Saladin now admitted his restraint. There was no mass killing, no revenge-driven purge. His conquest was, by the standards of the age, remarkably humane. After recapturing Jerusalem in 1187, Saladin restored Islamic worship at its sacred sites, cleansing the Dome of the Rock and Al-Aqsa Mosque of Christian alterations. The removal of the cross from the dome was celebrated as a moment of profound Islamic triumph. However, Saladin showed notable restraint. He did not destroy Christian churches, and he respected the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, allowing it to remain under Christian control. In a strategic and tolerant move, he replaced the Latin Catholic clergy with Greek Orthodox leadership, permitting Eastern Christians, Greek, Syrian, Armenian, to stay and worship freely. Western pilgrims were also allowed to visit, as long as they paid a small tribute, an arrangement that was later formalized in the 1192 treaty with Richard the Lionheart. Jerusalem's fall ended 88 years of Crusader rule and marked Saladin as a hero across the Muslim world. He was hailed as guardian of the two Qiblas, Mecca and Jerusalem. Importantly, the city was now ruled by the Ayyubi dynasty, led by non-Arabs. Saladin himself was a Sunni Kurd, and many of his commanders were Turks or other ethnicities. This signaled a major shift in Islamic leadership from the older Arab caliphates to new Turkic Kurdish powers, a trend that would continue under the Mamluks and later the Ottomans. For the Crusaders, losing Jerusalem was a devastating spiritual blow. The event shocked Europe and led to the launch of the Third Crusade, setting the stage for one of the most iconic confrontations in history, Richard the Lionheart versus Saladin. The Third Crusade, from 1189 to 1192, was born from the shock of Jerusalem's fall to Saladin in 1187. It brought two towering figures of history face to face: Richard the Lionheart of England and Salahuddin al-Ayyubi, the Muslim sultan who had reclaimed the Holy City. Though they clashed on the battlefield, their rivalry was tempered by a surprising mutual respect. marked by chivalry, diplomacy, and even the exchange of gifts across enemy lines. Despite several military victories, Richard never reached his ultimate goal, retaking Jerusalem. The city stood strong, and Saladin refused to relinquish it. Realizing he lacked the resources to hold it, even if captured, Richard chose diplomacy over further bloodshed. In 1292, the two leaders agreed to the Treaty of Jaffa. Under its terms, Jerusalem would remain under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims would be guaranteed safe passage to visit the holy sites so long as they paid a modest tribute. The treaty brought a fragile peace, but not closure. Europe remained obsessed with the Holy City. Over the next century, 6 more Crusades would be launched, each more desperate than the last. None succeeded in restoring Christian rule over Jerusalem. The Fourth Crusade, astonishingly, never even reached the Holy Land, instead sacking Christian Constantinople. Others collapsed under poor planning, disease, or defeat. Finally, in 1291, the dream of a Crusader kingdom came crashing down. The last Christian stronghold in the Levant, Acre, was conquered by the Mamluks. Crusader fortresses were abandoned, and their ships disappeared from the harbours of the eastern Mediterranean. Nearly 2 centuries of Christian military campaigns had ended, not in triumph, but in slow, irreversible defeat. Jerusalem had endured it all, and remained under Muslim rule. From that point forward, the city would no longer be contested by European kings, but would pass into the care of new Muslim powers, the Ayyubids, Mamluks, and ultimately the Ottomans. In Part 9, we journey into this next era, the age of sultans and shadows. Ottoman Jerusalem, a city wrapped in imperial splendor and spiritual silence, where minarets rose beside church bells and the echoes of prophets lingered in stone and prayer. Join us in Part 9 as we uncover the quiet yet profound transformation of a city and how centuries of Ottoman rule shaped the soul of a city sacred to all 3 Abrahamic faiths. If you enjoyed this episode, please like the video and subscribe to Darvesh Chronicles for more untold stories of faith, struggle, and legacy. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode. Until next time, may peace and blessings be upon you.